Good evening, everybody, and welcome to BrisScience for August 2022. I am your MC for this evening, Joel Gilmore, and it is fantastic to be back here at the State Library of Queensland. This is BrisScience, Brisbane's series of free public lectures on science, where we aim to bring not just the best scientists, but also the best communicators to share cutting-edge research with us here in Brisbane and indeed across the world through our recorded videos on YouTube. This series is brought to you by the University of Queensland, who has been running these events for many, many years now, and it's become a real part of our Brisbane culture, and it's great now that we're out of COVID to see so many people back here in person as well. Before I get started, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting tonight and pay my respect to elders both past and present. It's a great opportunity to recognise that the first people of Australia were some of the first scientists in the world, and their knowledge of caring for our land and shaping it still helps to inform our thinking today. So, before I introduce our speaker, a couple of quick bits of housekeeping. We will be having a presentation followed by some Q&A, and then there will be some opportunity for some snacks outside. So I'd love you to hang around, join us, have a chat, and celebrate this cultural science experience. In terms of questions, we will be taking questions through an app. You can see the QR code and the link there. So if you have your smartphone, if you want to scan that in, you'll be able to go on there, ask questions throughout the evening, and then I will go through as many of those questions as I can at the end of the night. But as I said, there will be an opportunity to ask some more questions directly one-on-one from our speaker, who'll be hanging around for a while afterwards. Okay, so in terms of our topic tonight, if you cast your mind back many years ago, we used to do this thing called going outside. Yes, way back in 2019, people used to go off, sometimes not even wearing masks, and explore the thing called nature. Now, the Victorians may not remember this at all, but it's something that is very close to many of our hearts. But we also know that some people perhaps are more enthusiastic about nature than others. Why is that? And what's the broader connection between humans and nature? To answer those questions and many more, we have a fantastic speaker tonight, Professor Richard Fuller from the University of Queensland. Richard studies the interaction between people and nature, and that includes both how we impact on nature and how we might be able to reduce or reverse some of the damage that occurs from humanity, but also how nature impacts on us. So, to tell us more and to take us deeper into that wonderful wide world outside, please put your hands together and welcome Professor Richard Fuller.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming tonight. It's very humbling to see so many people have come out tonight. So thank you so much for coming. It's wonderful to see so many old friends in the audience and lots of new friends too. So I thank you for sharing your evening with me. I'm Professor Richard Fuller. I've been at the University of Queensland for around 15 years or so now. You may be able to adduce by my accent, I'm not an Australian. I come from the UK, of course, where there is a great deal of love for nature, and it's been a topic that I'm become super fascinated in. So when I was young, there's me sitting on the train. I didn't have dreams of becoming a biologist. I wanted to be a train driver. Who doesn't want to be a train driver at that age? But the world had other ideas for me. As a gangly, awkward teenager, it turned out that I actually had a love for nature. I spent lots of my childhood spending time in nature. My mum used to drop me off at 5 o'clock in the morning, sit in the car park at the local nature reserve while I was out bird watching. Looking back, I realised the sacrifice and sheer effort and commitment that went into that. And perhaps, as a result of those experiences, I became, if you like, the odd one out, the nature-obsessed individual within our family. I was really committed to this stuff. And later, I just gave in to being an awkward teenager and volunteered at a nature reserve. I spent a lot of time volunteering in a reserve in South London, close to where I lived. I was a massive fan of Pink Floyd back then, and still am today, I'm pleased to report. And here we are building some kind of pond-dipping platform for people to come to the nature reserve and spend time with nature. And I met some fascinating people when I was volunteering at this nature reserve. And one of the people I met, the memory of him stays with me to this day. When he turned up to volunteer at the nature reserve, he would wear a badge. And on the badge, it would say, "I hate people." I hate people. That was his conservation philosophy. And I guess I can kind of see where he's coming from. 25% of the world's mammals, and absolutely, aren't they beautiful? 25% of them threatened with imminent extinction. Not just some distant, slight risk. Pressing threat of imminent extinction. 1 in 8 of the world's bird species similarly threatened with imminent extinction. Rapid and horrifying clearance of natural habitats around the world by us, all of us. Massive losses of habitat. Half of the world's forests are gone. The climate is changing rapidly and reaching a point where the change in climate is spiraling out of control. What the consequences are for the planet, we do have some guesses, but we're only going to get one go at finding out. And if you look across a broad range of indicators of human impact on the environment, pretty much everything you look at is trending the wrong way, is impacting the environment around us. So I guess, to a certain extent, I can understand this guy's philosophy. I can understand where he's trying to come from. I hate people. What a fascinating philosophy. Of course, I think he's completely wrong. Yes, it's people that have caused the biodiversity crisis. It's you and I and all people, past and present. And therefore, it's only people that can solve the biodiversity crisis. Achieving effective environmental conservation is a job that only people can do. Only you and I and the other members of the human species can achieve this. Conservation is a human enterprise, and it's about changing human behavior. Now, me and many of my colleagues got into biology because we love spending time in nature, not because we want to study people. But I've begun to realize that if we are going to achieve broad-based environmental change, and we are making great progress, that progress is being achieved by changing ourselves, by understanding and changing human behavior. It's these people, it's all of us that are fighting for change. So a long-standing question within the science of what you might call environmental psychology, although it defies classification, this kind of science. One of the key questions is, why are some people committed to environmental action and others less so? Why are some people more strongly connected to nature than others? And a scientist by the name of Louise Chawla studied this question through a questionnaire survey to a number of people in different geographic locations around the world. This is just a sample of some of her results. She asked environmental professionals, why are you in this game? Why are you doing this job that pays you less than you would otherwise get if you deployed your skills in a commercial environment? Why do you do it? And people mentioned a lot of different things. Friends, family, education, being part of environmental organizations. But number one on the list was experience of natural areas. Spending time in nature was number one on the list of reasons why people said, I'm now working in environmental protection. And this has led to a range of science, really a huge amount of science, on that connection between spending time in nature and environmental awareness. Really leading to a paradigm that spending time in nature increases our environmental concern. And for some local-based perspective on this, Lara Franco, PhD student at UQ, studied just over 2,000 people right here in Brisbane. And she found one of the strongest, most consistent effects I've ever seen in social science data. Look at this. So along the bottom, we asked people, how much time do you spend visiting local parks? All right, so some people said, never, I never go to parks. Some people said every week. And the black bars on that graph are the strength of that person's connection to nature, their experiential connection, how much they love nature and spending time in it and being in nature. And you might say, well, that's obvious, it's circular. And it kind of is. People who spend more time in nature develop a closer connection to it. Or maybe those with a closer connection to it spend more time in there. But here's something interesting. Those open bars are conservation concern. And what you can see here is that there's very little relationship between that nature dose, the amount of time a person spends in nature, and how concerned they are about the environment. Suggesting that we can't think about all of these different aspects of being connected to nature as one thing. You may love being in nature, but you may not be enormously concerned about environmental conservation. I remember seeing an angler once landing a stingray, who'd caught a stingray kind of by mistake, and just bludgeoned the thing to death. There's someone who loves spending time in nature, right? An angler. But has a different perspective on the, I suppose, ethical and the conservation side of things. Humans are complex creatures. Probably the most complex creature on the planet. Anyway, let's go back to Louise Chawla. So she also asked a number of environmental professionals, what stage in your life did these different factors influence your concern for nature? And during childhood, people thought back to their childhood. And they thought, well, it was spending time outdoors as a child that really made a big difference in my life course. It was my family, the values that our family had that were inculcated into me. Thinking of their university years, people said, well, the educational component of my university education was very important. What my friends said was now much more important than what my family says, which might ring true for those of you with teenage children right now. Later in adulthood, more formal organizations tended to be more important in developing environmental awareness. But it's this left-hand one that has really grabbed the interest of much of the world, experiences of nature during childhood. And there's been lots of work over the years trying to understand what changes there may have been in the way children in particular interact with nature. More than half of the world's population now lives in cities. In Australia, more than 90% of us live in cities, spend more or less our entire lives in, if you like, the concrete jungle. What does that mean for our connection to nature and our experiences of nature? And when we think that on average, Australian children spend less time outdoors in an average day than maximum security prisoners, perhaps it is something that we should be concerned about. And it's not just raising the next generation of people that are going to save the planet. Spending time with nature has fundamental benefits for human health and well-being. Here's a really brilliant study that was done back in the 1980s. Roger Ulrich studied a group of patients who were recovering from gallbladder surgery. These days, it's a keyhole job, and it's all kind of done. Those days, you had to spend a few days in hospital. Not a major operation, but a few days in hospital. What Roger Ulrich did was to randomly assign some of the recovering patients to a room whose window overlooked a brick wall, and another group of patients to a room whose window overlooked trees and nature outside. And you can guess where I'm going to go with this. The patients who were assigned to the room with the nature view recovered 1.5 days more quickly than the patients whose room overlooked a brick wall. They received fewer negative notes from nurses on the progress of their recovery, and they required fewer and weaker painkillers and sedatives on their recovery journey. So this isn't just kind of fuzzy benefits. This is real, measurable, physiological benefits of something like a view of nature out of the window of the room that you're in. So nature has the potential to be fundamentally benefiting human health and well-being, yet often we overlook this critically important role that nature has in our lives. Danielle Shanahan brought some of this work again to Brisbane, studying 2,500 people from the city of Brisbane in a major study looking at health and well-being benefits of nature. Danielle did her postdoc at UQ a number of years ago now. One of Danielle's landmark findings was her work on depression. She found that the population risk of having depression declined with the more time a person spent in nature. So people that basically spent very little time in nature had pretty much the same chance of having depression as the population at large. People who spent half an hour in nature per week had a significantly lower risk of having depression than the population at large. And that depression risk went down and down and down as the nature dose increased, suggesting a relationship between those two factors. So it may well be, and there's other science on this too, that the risk and the incidence of depression is actually impacted, can be reduced by spending time in nature. In fact, when you crunch all the numbers using a health economics approach, you could work out that spending just half an hour in nature per week, we estimate would reduce cases of depression by 7%, and in a separate analysis, hypertension by 9%. They may sound like relatively small numbers to you, but Australia spends $12 billion a year dealing with the consequences of depression, and the human cost of that debilitating condition is incalculable. So a reduction of 7 or 9% in those conditions, which are among the world's most important non-communicable diseases, is massive. It's absolutely massive. From something as simple as spending some time in nature. And the science on this topic has reached the level that doctors across Europe, in particular, are leading the way, and now formally prescribing time in nature for a number of patients in their care. And again, this is not just because of some warm and fuzzy conception that nature's generally good for us. It's real, hard, measurable science. And over the last few decades, there's been, I could talk for hours about all of this stuff. There's been study after study after study on hundreds and hundreds of different aspects of our health and well-being, including economic factors. People pay more for a house in areas where there is more nature available around that house. It alleviates ADHD. Nature reduces violent crime, improves cognitive function. These are all things that translate directly into human and economic benefits. The risk of somebody resigning from their job is much lower if they have a view of nature out of their office window. So bosses in here, take note. And all of this kind of work has really culminated, I think, in movements all around the world to try to reconnect us with nature. And I think these kinds of initiatives are incredibly important in trying to collectively re-educate ourselves and get back to nature and start spending time there. Because it benefits us, it benefits our health and well-being, and it benefits society at large. So one of the big questions that's really consumed me and my research over the last decade or so has been that one of why it is that many of us would rather spend our time doing something like this, and I'm looking at my kids on the front row, versus something like this. Why is it? What makes us make those different choices? Both in terms of nature experiences that we might enjoy, and in terms of the way we think about environmental issues, right? So there's sort of two issues at play. There's the direct liking and loving nature, and there's also environmental concern and conservation concern. I'm going to take you through a number of pieces of work that have been done over the years. And as I was putting this talk together, I realized that this field is dominated by brilliant female scientists, and it's been really brilliant to see that over the years. For every piece of science I'm showing you tonight was led by a female scientist, which I think is fantastic. Overcoming a lot of barriers to reach the top of their field. And this first piece of work is by Liz Barber and Julie Dean. And what they did was to take a population-level approach and look at connection to nature across populations. And they discovered that connection to nature, I won't bore you with how we measure it, but it is well understood how to measure it properly. We're not just measuring it in a fuzzy way. There's a proper psychological scale. Nature connectedness is lower among young people. So finally, we've got a right to grumble at the younger generation. Now, why is that? This is a snapshot of the population. Again, these are actually data from Brisbane once again. So these are all local data from right here. There appears to be a strong impact of age on nature concern. Why is this? Now, it could be that we all experience an epiphany in our 40s, right? So that we change as individuals through our life course and become more connected to nature as we move through our lives. And that may be true. There's some evidence that we become more selfless and more concerned for others as we move through our lives. And that makes biological sense as well as social sense. There's another more disturbing possibility, right? That there's a kind of cohort that's moving through this population that someone who's 36 now and has that low connection to nature is going to have a similarly low connection to nature when they reach 70, right? And we can't distinguish those two possibilities from these data alone, unfortunately. And I don't know of any study yet. Some have got very close. What we need is really good longitudinal data that follows people throughout their lives. And we're getting close with some data sets now. So we don't know actually the answer to the question. Rachel O, who's sitting right here in the audience, spent some time looking at whether there's been a long-term change in connection to nature in a suburb in Singapore, one of the most, I suppose, heavily urbanized city-states in the world. Has there been a decline in connection to nature over a long period? Rachel found a study that was done in 1996 in this particular suburb in Singapore. And she went out and replicated exactly that study that was done 22 years previously to see whether connection to nature in that suburb had declined over 2 decades. That's what you would expect, right? That's in a way what all the popular science tells you, that we're all becoming disconnected progressively from nature. Well, it turns out that's wrong, at least for that particular suburb in Singapore. And Rachel's study is really one of the very few, if only, study that's really done this properly over such a long period. Rachel found 2 neat discoveries. First of all, people spend about the same time in nature now, or at least in 2018 when the fieldwork was done, compared to 22 years previously. People spent about the same time in nature. They're not spending less time in nature, at least as measured by various aspects of their use of local nature around where they live. And what's more is that their connection to nature was basically exactly the same in 2018 compared to 1996. We're not talking about the same people, but we're talking about 2 studies done in the same place and in exactly the same way. So connection to nature had not declined over that 20-year period in Singapore, challenging a lot of what we think we know about this field. And the more we go through doing empirical studies, the more I think we are challenging what we thought we knew about this stuff from the popular science books that you might read. Jessica Pinder, highly talented honours student, took a deep dive in trying to understand, well, if it's not just a generalized change in nature, what is it that makes a person more connected to nature than others? She wanted to study people who had clear memories of their childhood, and she told me that undergraduates have much clearer memories of their childhoods than old professors like me, because their childhood was much more recent. I believed her, and she did a study of undergraduates across Australia who were studying a range of different courses. So she got some kind of environmental scientists and biologists and some engineers and just a range of different students across university courses. She looked at a whole bunch of factors that might explain why some of those students were more strongly connected to nature than others. It's a slightly complicated graph, but you don't really need to look at it. I can tell you the answers that are in here. The results were surprising. Sort of surprising and not surprising. First of all, she found that people that came from families that had biospheric family values were more likely to be connected to nature. What on earth does that mean? Well, if your family values nature and transmits that value system to you, then you kind of inherit that and grow into that. In the study, Jessica asked about family values. It was all done in a sort of a neat way so that people couldn't guess what she was getting at. There was a negative effect of egoistic family values. So if your family's main sort of agenda is let's get ahead, let's kind of beat the competition and get ahead, then you're not likely to have children who are strongly connected to nature. She found those that engaged in environmental volunteer work, like I did, as a youngster, tended to grow up more connected to nature. What I think is most interesting about Jessica's study is what she didn't find. And she didn't find that spending more time in nature as a child was associated with connection to nature as a young adult. Again, I think overturning some of what you think you might know and what we thought we knew about this stuff. But when we actually look at the data and we ask real people, we can't find a lot of these effects which perhaps we just think we know in our heads. And people who spent lots of time camping and lots of family nature experiences seem to be no more likely to be connected to nature as young adults. So that study really overturned, again, some of what we thought we knew. Georgia Day, another highly talented honours student, came to me one day and said, I'm a bit bored of all the desk work that you do in your lab and all the computer work and questionnaires and all that. I want to go out and study people actually outside. So she teamed up with Earthwatch, who provide citizen science experiences for people. And Earthwatch very generously provided support for the project. Georgia got to go snorkeling in Ningaloo while I held the fort in the office. And she went on some of these citizen science expeditions, and she measured how much time people spent in nature on these trips, and then whether the person had experienced a kind of epiphany, a kind of rethinking, and a stronger connection to nature. Did people who had those encounters with nature become more connected? So she studied some trips where people spent a lot of time on computers. Sometimes citizen science is like that because sometimes real science is also like that. And she found that the people who spent lots of time on computers had a kind of average amount of sort of change and learning. She also measured the amount of time on the trips that people spent actually experiencing nature. And these are not just everyday experience. This is not going down your local park. Well, if it is, then you're extremely lucky. These are kind of flagship. These are once in a lifetime or real deep experiences of nature. According to all the textbooks, these kinds of things should drive big change in a person, being exposed to, experiences of nature like this. But the answer was no. That wasn't it either. The one thing that caused people who were on these Earthwatch expeditions to have an epiphany and to have a kind of big change in their environmental thinking was the social environment of the trip. Those who said that the social and cultural environment of the trip was kind of magical and they felt connected with other people who were there, those were the ones who showed a big increase in their environmental awareness. It was a human thing. It wasn't to do with contacting nature and spending time in nature. Nicola Sockhill is also here tonight. This was for her honours. She's now a PhD student at UQ. Finding out yet even more surprising things about the way in which Australians interact with nature. Nicola studied a national data set that's nationally representative of Australians and finding some extreme, well, at least to me, surprising things. Nicola measured pro-environmental behaviour. In other words, things that we do to protect the environment. In some cases, those are physical things kind of outside, maybe engaging in tree planting or restoration activities and so on. In other cases, they're advocating for change or signing campaigning documents and so on. All right, so pro-conservation behaviour. What Nicola found was that across the political spectrum, there was actually very little difference in the extent to which people engaged in these strongly pro-environmental behaviours. There was a bit of an effect. So this is the percentage of people who do 3 or more pro-conservation behaviours for biodiversity itself. around 60% of people who say they're going to vote green engage in 3 or more pro-environmental behaviours. Around half of people who say they're going to vote Labour, and around half of people who say they're going to vote LNP or One Nation. Now, I found that fascinating, and it revealed to me that I have stereotypes as a scientist about political alignment and connection to nature and environmental concern. And both Nicola and I, as we were working through these data, were feeling very challenged about that. And it was really an illuminating exercise to go through that data and just look at the data and learn from what it was telling us. So pro-environmental concern is not limited to one section of society. It's all across society in a range of ways, I think, perhaps, that we're only just beginning to understand. So far we've thought about studies that are mainly correlative, right? And what do we mean? Well, we're asking people about their connection to nature, we're asking them about various factors, and we're seeing whether those things are connected to each other statistically. Here we are again at our computers. Now to finish, this was some work that takes a much deeper approach, a much more fundamental approach, and says, is there a genetic component to the extent to which a person is concerned and connected to nature? Now, this may strike you as a surprising question to ask. And it is, in a way. And initially, I just wanted to ask it because I thought it would be fun. But then I realized, if you think about it, it does make a lot of sense. Being strongly connected to nature would have been incredibly important for the survival of early humans. I think there's no question about that. So I think it makes perfect sense for there to be a strongly genetically controlled component of being connected to nature. So maybe all these conflicting studies that are coming out of the science are because actually we're just looking at the wrong thing. And all the time it was genetics. And maybe people can't, you can't change your genetics. So what was the answer? Well, Chia Chen led a brilliant study, really a very ambitious study, from using data from the UK. In the UK, there's a huge bank of data on twins. And we managed to get permission to ask those twins a range of questions about their connection to nature. Why would we ask twins? Well, the key for working out whether there's a genetic component to something is comparing identical twins with fraternal twins. How does this work? Think for a moment about these 3 sibling pairs. All of these, brothers and sisters and sisters, they share the same environment. They're brought up in the same family environment, exposed to a lot of the same things as youngsters. But of course, there is a key difference between those fraternal and identical twins. The fraternal twins, of course, have different genes. They happen to be conceived at the same time, but they're independent people, they're different people, different genes. Of course, identical twins are still different people, but they have the same genes, right? This is a really important difference. So the question then becomes, do identical twins have a more similar connection to nature than fraternal twins? And if that's the case, if these two have a very similar connection to nature, whereas these 2 pairs have actually, it could be quite different, then we suspect there's a genetic component. Does that make sense? Hopefully that makes sense. We can separate out the genetics from the environment. You may just have to believe me on that. Here's a complicated graph. I apologize for that. I'm nearly through. the answer was there is a genetic component. Those identical twins are indeed much more similar to each other in their connection to nature than the fraternal twins, which are down here. This is a measure of their correlation in their nature connection. Identical twins tend to be really similar to each other in their connection to nature. They could both be strongly connected or both be weakly connected, but the point is they're similar to each other, suggesting there's a strong genetic component. And there's a number of complicated analyses one can do to measure it all and work it all out. What was really surprising, I think, and interesting in this study was the other things that also showed a strong genetic inheritance. Actual nature dose. So the behavior of those siblings was also genetically, in part, genetically contributed to. The amount of time a person spent in nature was more similar amongst the identical twins than it was amongst the fraternal twins. So to sum all of that up, what does it actually mean in something that we can remember and quote at a dinner party tomorrow night? 46% of our love for nature appears to be inherited, according to the genetic data. 46%. Now that's quite a lot. It's not unheard of. There are actually lots and lots of personality traits which are quite strongly inherited, right? Those of you who are bold and brash and have bold and brash children won't be surprised by that. Those who are shy and have shy children and so on. We're used to that, right? We're used to it. It's not unexpected and it's not that surprising that connection to nature has quite a strong genetic component, about 46%. But does that mean we can't change our connection to nature? Of course not. It means more than half of it is up for grabs. So if you want to reap the health and well-being benefits of nature, or if you want someone close to you to reap them, or if you want to deepen your concern or society's concern for conservation, we've got everything to play for. There is a genetic component, but there's also a strong, what here is termed a unique environment component. That means things that happen to you as an individual and things that you do as an individual. So where does all this leave us? This kind of swirling science that's really taken us on a journey all over the place. Well, I think clearly spending time in nature is good for us. The science is absolutely clear on that, and there's really no question about it. Almost every time someone does a study, you find significant benefits of spending time in nature. Spending time in nature is good for your health and well-being, full stop. There's absolutely no question about it. There's emerging evidence, but I think conflicting evidence, that spending time in nature generates environmental concern. On balance, I don't think that's a very strong effect. I think concern for the environment comes through other routes. We could discuss some of that a bit later. Love for nature is absolutely partly innate, and I think that makes good evolutionary sense, and it aligns with what we know about other personality traits. But the real message, I think, from all of this, there's lots we can do to influence our connection to nature, for reaping those health and well-being benefits, and potentially for creating the next generation of environmentalists that will save the world. And on that note, I shall leave you with the words of Frank Lloyd. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Richard, for that inspiring talk. And feels like we really should wrap up immediately and head straight outside. But we are going to instead take some questions before we go and explore nature tonight. So don't forget, we've got the QR code up on the screen there and chance for you to ask some questions. So head on there. I see there's already a bunch of questions coming through. BrisScience, in the meantime, will be back next month, as we are every month. So make sure you head to our website, sign up to the mailing list, head to our Twitter, etc., so you can be notified, because next month we have quite a special talk, which is that if you cast your mind back, if anybody was here in 2006, in the early days of BrisScience, we had a fantastic speaker, Jenny Graves from La Trobe University, who was speaking about sex chromosomes and the future of men. Was anybody at that talk? No, no one here. Well, I was at it, which now I feel old. But next month we are bringing Jenny back 16-ish years later for an update on her work and where the male sex chromosome is tracking. So it's going to be, she's a brilliant speaker in her own right, and for those of you, me, who were there last time, it's a really exciting chance to update that. So make sure you head on and book tickets for that. All right, enough. Are you ready for some questions?
Yes, indeed.
All right, well, let me flick back here to the question app. Okay, first question is from Rory, who asks, how do you actually measure connection to nature?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a number of different ways of doing it. The answer is psychological scales, right? So a lot of these measures are question-based. So you may, when you've done surveys, you will have seen these things. How much do you agree with the following statement? I strongly disagree, disagree, agree, strongly agree, right? That's the structure of the questions. And in many of these connection to nature scales, there'll be questions like, I enjoy digging in the garden, getting my hands dirty. My ideal vacation spot is in a wilderness as far as possible away from people. The future of the world's non-human environment is important to me, right? These kinds of things that probe different aspects of connection to nature. Now, some of these scales are focused on environmental concern, some of them are focused on enjoyment of nature, some of them are focused on things like how important nature is to your own personal identity and sense of place, and so on. So there's a range of scales out there. There's like a menu of different scales you can choose from. But with these psychological scales, they're not just totally made up. They're carefully analyzed to make sure that the questions get answered in a consistent way and in a way that's readily able to be interpreted. So if you're looking for scales to measure things like connection to nature, do your searching carefully and make sure you find scales that have been well and truly tested and validated by the psychological research community. So these scales tend to get produced by environmental psychologists who study this stuff for a living and know how to do it very well. Yeah.
Fantastic. We've got a lot of questions coming through here. Kids, great time to borrow a smartphone and ask anonymous questions as well if you want to get all the true goss. So maybe building on that, and sorry, Anna also had that same question there. I'll just give Anna a call out there. We've got a couple of questions here around what are some ways, from Kyle, what are some ways to influence the unique environment factor as children or in adulthood?
Okay.
Or Abby asks, if I don't really like nature, what actions can I best do to change that environmental component and get the benefits you mentioned?
So I'm afraid to say there is no single easy answer. It's a great question. That is the question in many ways. I don't think there's a single recipe, right, that's going to work for everybody. I think we're all different. And I think the message that I've got from the science is that the more studies we do, the more things we find, right, that can affect a person's connection to nature and enjoyment of nature. So for some people, having organized programs where they go out and, if you like, get supervised and guided about how to enjoy nature can be really powerful and important, all right, for someone who will respond well to that kind of activity. There are some people who are terrified of nature, actually, and find it threatening and just don't enjoy it at all. And for people like that, a guided experience where they can be encouraged to interpret what they're seeing and understand what they're seeing and evaluate risks and so on and dangers and just start to understand and learn some of the stories, like, might be really powerful for those. On the front row, there's someone who runs a reptile awareness program, and connecting Australians with the amazing reptile diversity that's here in Australia. But of course, a lot of us have strong feelings about reptiles, right? But those kinds of things are important ways of trying to, partly challenge ourselves, but partly kind of educate ourselves and realign ourselves so that we can kind of get into nature more. There's a lot of things here that I don't want to go on for too long, but it's really about matching the things that, to us as individuals, we're not all going to respond to exactly the same thing. Yeah.
Great answer. Disappointing that there is no simple magic pill I can take, but this is great. Okay, so a couple of questions around the evolutionary link. And so Anna asks, is there work to identify why biospheric family values are fundamental to being connected? And Dana asks, what's the evolutionary reason for nature being beneficial to humans, and why would that be genetic? So are you able to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think those are questions on my mind as well, to be perfectly honest. I think this field is new. Chia Chen was the first person to show there's a strong genetic component to connection to nature, and the paper's only just come out. I mean, this is sort of cutting-edge new stuff. I think at the bottom line, with the evolutionary side of all of this, is that having a strong connection to nature was crucial in human evolution at times when we absolutely depended for our daily survival on capturing hunting. I mean, if you want to hunt an animal, you have got to be so exquisitely connected to nature, it's almost untrue. I'm a pretty keen bird watcher. I've been bird watching in Papua New Guinea with local guides from a village in the Upper Fly River in Papua New Guinea. And I went out bird watching with those guys, and I was blown away. Their perception of birds, their ability to find birds, was just, I just couldn't even understand how they did it. It was like extrasensory perception. They would just walk around and then, oh, look, there's a kingfisher right at the top of that tree, 50 meters up. And I was blundering around like an idiot in the forest. Even though I'm an experienced bird watcher, I spent my entire life bird watching. So we're talking about a level of connection to nature. When your survival depends on it, there's going to be a genetic control for that kind of thing. Selection is going to act quickly. Those who don't have a strong connection to nature, who are not intimately aware of nature and hooked into it, are just not going to survive. So I think the bottom line is I think that is the kind of basic explanation as to why this is happening. I'd love to see more work done in this area.
Great. Are you up for a couple more questions?
Totally.
All right, just a couple more. We've a question from Antonella, who asks, have there been studies on the effect of being in nature that has been destroyed or harmed? I guess
Yes.
A negative.
That's a really good point. You may have noticed on the table right at the beginning, one of the items there was negative experiences, seeing nature harmed. And many people do cite that as one of the reasons why they are now strongly connected to the environment. And there have been a number of other studies since then that have shown in some people witnessing something negative happening to nature makes them, fires them up, if you like, and gives them an environmental concern. And you may have heard of the whole idea of extinction of experience. That's an idea that is based around the concept that the nature we know and love is disappearing bit by bit. And when that happens, it fires us up and makes us, I suppose, in part angry and desperate to try and recover that nature. So the answer is yes. I think there is a strong effect of that. I think, speaking from my own experience, it can also go too far. I've now reached the point where I work in conservation day in, day out. I'm exposed to some pretty bad news a lot of the time. And I actually find it very difficult, personally, to process a lot of the negative news about the environment. And I have to say, when there are stories around Amazonian deforestation in the media, sometimes I just can't look. It's almost got to that stage where I just can't look. So I think that exposure to those negative stories is something we have to treat carefully, I think, as a tool in conservation. Because the other component to that is that too much doom and gloom is disempowering and can cause apathy and disengagement, I think, because it's traumatic, right? And people don't want to see it, and it doesn't really give them an action. So I think when we're communicating, I'm off topic slightly, but I think it's relevant. I think when we're communicating about environmental issues, it is important to think about whether our message should be optimistic or pessimistic. And even if it has some negative components, try and bring in some positive actions that people can take as well. So I think negative news is important, but we need to treat it carefully.
Fantastic. One more question for you now in terms of research. If you got a very generous grant, maybe Elon, as we say, Elon decides actually he doesn't care about Twitter, he cares about nature now. Okay, bad example, but let's say there's a billionaire who really cares. And they gave the grant. What would you do? What's your big project?
The one thing that I've always wanted to do is work out what bits of nature are really important in delivering these health and well-being benefits. You may have noticed as I went through that talk, a lot of the measures we have are very crude. How much time are you spending outdoors? How long are you visiting parks? How frequently? These are very crude measures of experience of nature. So I'd love to do two things. The first is to really get inside our heads and measure the nature dose that we have. So through all of our 5 senses and real time and measuring that. I don't know what the device is, but it needs to be invented that enables that to happen so that we can really measure the amount of dose of nature that we're getting. And the second thing is I really want to know which bits of nature are important, right? A football field is green and a rainforest is green. But something tells me those two different environments are going to have different impacts on our health and well-being. And we know at a gross level that's true. But what we don't know is, does it matter having lots of different plants and animals in a place? Or is it just that one animal that pops out and that's the thing that really drives it? Do you know what I mean? So I think we need to understand at a much deeper level what it is about nature that's providing this massive range of different benefits. And are there different benefits from different bits of nature? So, what bits of nature do we need to build into our CBDs versus our suburbs versus our, edge areas where we live and so on? How do we design nature, especially into our built environment, in a way that's going to benefit us the most?
That is a fantastic answer. And last question, which is just I want to know from you, is what is your favourite place? Where have you visited? If you're going anywhere in nature, what's your favourite place?
For me, you can't go past arid Australia. You just can't go past it. And it's a place where, maybe it's because it gets me far away from people.
Great. That has been one of the most inspiring talks, and I think such a broad mix of both science and the psychological component of interacting between science and nature and people. So thank you for that, and we'll definitely look forward to having you back in 16 years as well to share the next interaction. But for now, please put your hands together. The incredible Professor
Thank you very
Richard
much.
Fuller.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. That's very kind. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Please come and join us outside for a drink and a chat. And thank you for everyone who put in questions. Sorry we didn't get to them all, but we'll see you next month. Cheers.